The Triathlon Show 338. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Michael Liberzon. Michael is a Toronto-based triathlon coach, a bike fitter and aero tester, and he's the host of the Endurance Innovation podcast. In this episode, Michael explains what gains can be made by upgrading from a road bike to a time trial bike, and also how things like the type of course and terrain can impact your choice of bike and the choice of your bike setup and configurations, including things like use of disc wheel and so on. Before we get into the interview, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. Precision Fuel and Hydration have a range of tools and products to help you personalize your fueling and hydration strategy so that you can perform at your best. Everyone sweats differently, including both sweat rate and sweat sodium concentration. So your hydration strategy should be individualized to that. And your fueling strategy should also be individualized based on the duration and intensity of exercise or competition. You can use the free online sweat test and the quick carb calculator on precisionfuelandhydration.com to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs during training and racing. And you can book a free one-on-one video consultation to refine your strategy. As a listener of That Triathlon Show, you can get 15% off your first order of products by using the code TTS22 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Roka. When Roka got started in 2011, the challenge they set out to solve was to create the world's fastest wetsuit, which resulted in what in its current iteration is the Maverick X2 wetsuit. In 2021, they set themselves a different challenge 10 years after inception, which was to take their extremely high standards and the key features of the Maverick X2, but create a very budget-friendly entry-level wetsuit that doesn't compromise those standards and incorporates as much as possible of the key features of their flagship model in it. And that result is the Maverick wetsuit, which at $275 is an entry-level option price-wise, but in terms of quality and performance, it definitely does not play in the entry-level leagues. And I can confirm this because Roka sent me one of their Maverick wetsuits, and I tried it out, and it feels really fast. And I would not believe that that's an entry-level wetsuit just based on how I felt in it. It felt super, super good, super buoyant, and I had great mobility in it as well. Roka, of course, incorporates their arms of technology in that wetsuit as in all of their other wetsuits and tri-suits. You can read more about the Maverick on Roka.com, and you can get 20% off your entire Roka order on Roka.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, here's my interview with Michael Liberzon. Welcome back to That Triathlon Show, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Michael. You're catching me at a good time. I'm just coming out of COVID, as we talked about in our before we started recording, and I finally regained the full functionality of my voice. So your timing was excellent for this invitation.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that you're on the mend, and hope that remains the case for a long time. For listeners that might not have heard you on the previous episodes that you've done or on your own podcast, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about who you are?
Sure. Yeah. As Michael mentioned, I have been on That Triathlon Show a couple of times. I also host my own podcast that deals with interesting and novel things in the endurance sport realm. It's called the Endurance Innovation Podcast, which, like I said, I host with another gentleman from Canada, Andrew Buckroll, and there we talk to folks who are in the industry, who are studying aerodynamics, who are studying heat transfer, who do training and think about psychology in endurance sport. Basically, anything that we think can improve the experience of the endurance athlete. On top of that, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I am also a triathlon coach based out of Toronto, Canada.
Yeah, and you have also have a lot of experience with aerodynamic testing, and we'll get to that in a bit. As you mentioned, your podcast deals a lot with the technical side of things. There, for people interested in aerodynamics, for example, or heat transfer, two of the main topics that you mentioned there. There's no better place to go, I think, than your podcast, and you are a source that I go to directly sometimes when I have a question in any of those
Nice.
any of those areas. So we have a couple of topics today, and what we'll do is, depending on how much time we take, we might split this interview into 2 episodes, but we'll just see how long each topic takes. And the first one is a topic that came about actually from one of my athletes, and it's a question of whether to go upgrade from a road bike to a tri bike, basically. So we have a couple of things here to discuss and a couple of parameters to take into account. But let's start with just the simple basics. Why is it faster in most triathlon races to race on a TT bike rather than a road bike?
Well, I think you hinted at this answer, Michael, when you said that we'd be talking about aerodynamics. So there is in a nutshell, that's your answer. The answer is, of course, aerodynamics. Just to put it fairly simply, on most in most cycling conditions, unless you're going up a fairly substantial incline, the greatest thing that is holding you back as a cyclist from increasing your speed or even just holding your speed is aerodynamic drag. Depending on the situation and obviously depending on the terrain, that the percentage of your power that you're putting into the pedals that is then going into overcoming aerodynamic drag is anywhere from 70 to as high as 85%. And this is very much dependent on speed, but that's the range. So if you think about, okay, I want to go faster, I want to complete this race faster, or the flip side of faster, this is from, I love this quote from Damon Renard, who used to be with Cervelo, and I think he went to Cannondale afterwards, is the flip side of faster is easier. So if you don't necessarily want to go faster, but you want to use less energy for the same amount of, for the same speed, then being more aerodynamic which directly affects efficiency in this case, means that you are expending less metabolic energy in getting from A to B in your race. So the very short answer, and I'm sure you'll come back with a follow up as to why, but the very short answer is that on a triathlon bike, almost everybody is going to be more aerodynamic than a road bike.
And why is that? Why is a tri bike? why do we get better aerodynamically?
Yes. Okay. Of course. So it's actually not the bike itself. Rather, it's not the aerodynamic qualities of the bicycle itself. Now, it is definitely true that that even kind of an entry-level triathlon bike is going to be more aerodynamic than even a fairly advanced aero road bike. So if you just put the two side by side in a wind tunnel, you wouldn't do it side by side, but one after the other in a wind tunnel, the triathlon bike will have a slightly lower aero drag. But that's not the real kicker. The reason that triathlon bikes are that much more aerodynamic is because they allow the cyclist to assume a more aerodynamic position and to maintain it for a long period of time comfortably. And that's going to become important when I answer one of your follow-up questions.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
So maybe I'm sure that I know that you've done some quantification of this in the past. So can we get on to how much time athletes tend to gain by upgrading from a road bike to a tri bike? For maybe if you have numbers for each distance, for sprint, Olympic, half and full distance, then if you can give some examples to quantify, that would be really helpful.
Sure. First of all, I'm going to shout out Sebastian Schlurike of Aerotune, who I believe was a past guest on your show as well.
Yep.
He is the source of all of these numbers. So, Sebastian, thank you for sharing these with me at the last minute. So this is where these numbers come from. First, I'll cite them in CDA values. So for folks familiar with aerodynamic calculation, CDA is the non-dimensional coefficient that fits into the aerodynamic formula. And I'm happy to dive deep into this one, Michael, if you want me to, but suffice to say, you want this number to be as low as possible. The lower the number, the more aerodynamically efficient you are, or the less the aerodynamic drag is slowing you down. So in CDA, lower is better. That's what we got to understand. So the average CDA of a road cyclist, based on a lot of the tests that the folks at Aerotune have done, and these are tests also submitted by Aerotune users, is 0.319. That's a road bike. Compare that to a triathlon bike. The number is 0.232. So that is a very non-trivial difference. And then I'll follow up this with giving you specific time savings, because sometimes those numbers are a little bit abstract for folks. Like, yes, there's a big difference. There's an objectively big difference between the two numbers, but what does that mean for me as a cyclist? So using myself as an example, because obviously it'll depend on these time savings are going to depend on cyclist speed and power. If we're going to be, roughly 200 wattish for an Ironman, your time savings between road bike and triathlon bike are going to be in the area of 17 minutes. So 17 minutes for an Ironman, which is, quite a big amount of time if you've ever done one of these. And so as we go down in distance, obviously the time savings are going to go down as well. So roughly speaking, you're looking at 8.5 to 9 minutes for a 70.3, 4 to 5 minutes for an Olympic, and about 2 to 2.5 minutes for a sprint.
And let's talk about how power and speed might affect that. So first of all, if we have an athlete that is faster, that is really fast and strong on the bike, will they save more time or less time? And likewise, if we have a slower athlete with less power, less speed on the bike, how does that impact those calculations?
So this is a really interesting question. And so if we're talking about the way that the relationship between power and speed works in terms of aerodynamic drag alone. Now, there are other things that are slowing you down, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're focusing on aero drag. The power required to overcome aerodynamic drag is proportional to the cube of the velocity. Okay, so the faster you go, it gets harder to overcome aerodynamic drag, which is obvious, but it gets harder very, very, very quickly. So the advantage for a stronger, faster athlete in lowering their aero drag is, yes, you will go a little bit faster for the amount of power that you put into the pedals, but it is going to be it's going to be significant. But because those folks are actually spending less time on the course, the absolute time saved by a slower athlete, by someone who's putting out less power, may actually be larger, just because they're out there for longer, right? So if you're looking at elite males in an Ironman circuit going, what are they doing now? Like they're under 4 hours.
They're under 4 hours on a really fast course, or very close to 4 hours anyway. Yeah,
so under 4 hours, whereas an average age grouper on the same course, or maybe like a kind of like a middle of the pack person, might be 6 or more hours on that same course. So there's just a lot more opportunity for saving in terms of net minutes for a slower person. So this is why aerodynamics, paying attention to aerodynamics is something that's very useful to I would say folks all along the spectrum of speed, because if you're one of those people who is trying to make the cutoff, for 16, 17 hours, depending where you're racing, if you're racing an Ironman race, 20 minutes may very well be that difference between making your cutoff and not making the cutoff. And if you are at the pointy end where you're going around, at around 4 hours to finish the bike, then you'd still be saving probably close to 15 minutes if you were. I mean, it's a very big difference between a road bike and a tri bike. We're not talking about like aero optimization here. This is sort of a no-brainer, especially if you're, trying to win. You might be saving 15 minutes, which is, let's say in the pro field, a huge margin.
Yeah. What about fitting your road bike with TT bars so you can kind of get into a more aerodynamic position?
Yeah, this is definitely possible, and it's certainly, you see it on the ITU circuit, right? They use the shorty bars, and they use them to great effect, and it's definitely possible. And remember what I said earlier, that the bikes themselves aren't necessarily much less aerodynamic. The road bikes themselves aren't necessarily much less aerodynamic than triathlon bikes. The real difference here is comfort. So the triathlon bikes are designed kind of ground up to be comfortable in that race position for long periods of time. Road bikes are designed to be comfortable in that specific race position for a long period of time. Now, adding aerobars, so now that you're going from using your hands as the contact point on the bar to using your elbows or your forearms as the contact point on the bar, and it's if you can imagine the distance between saddle to bar is now being made up by much less of your body if you're losing the whole forearm as part of your reach. If you understand what I'm saying, Michael.
Yep.
So road bikes tend to be a lot longer than triathlon bikes, and having to make up that reach with an adjustment with pushing the saddle forward and then bringing the arm cups back on the extensions. It is 100% doable. I would say it's probably not optimal for longer races. That's why you see folks be very successful at the shorter races, especially in the ITU series with this setup. But you don't see a lot of high performance folks racing this way in a long course. The only exception, of course, was Taylor Knibb when she crushed. I forget what race it was, but she had by far she ran away with the bike split, and she was on a road bike with extensions. But that is the exception and not the rule. And then recently she switched to a full on TT bike. Because again, it's not necessarily that you cannot achieve the same kind of aerodynamic position on a road bike with extensions. It's much harder to be comfortable in that position given the inherent geometry differences between a road bike and a tri bike.
Yeah, and also in the example of Taylor Knibb, she still was only doing half distance races. Yes. In that setup. It might be a different story to do a full Ironman in that setup.
Totally agree with you. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Then, so if an athlete decides to go for an upgrade and go for a TT bike, what do you think are the most important considerations that they should keep in mind when it comes to selecting the right bike?
I love this question because I think there's so much, marketing, let's say, information out there where everyone's claiming that their triathlon superbike is the absolute fastest thing, and you'll see it's funny because you'll see the same bikes compared against each other, and depending on who's doing the comparison, the results are going to be different. So there's definitely some let's say cherry picking of the data that's happening from the manufacturers. But one thing that I will say is that in terms of just raw aerodynamic performance, frames have converged. So there is not a world of difference between a good frame from one manufacturer to the next. So there's really not a strong case to be made, I would say, from, I'm just throwing out names, from like picking a Trek versus a Cervelo versus, a Quintana Roo or any other excellent manufacturer out there. So what I would say is, make sure that the bike that you're purchasing has an excellent front end, and this is like the cockpit of the bike, the bar and extension system. And what I would consider excellent would be that it is very easy to adjust and it has a broad range of adjustment. Because one of the most important things, of course, is that the bike fits you, right? So if you're considering, if you're considering buying one, you really do your homework and make sure that what you're purchasing is going to fit, because there's nothing worse than it not fitting. And unlike a road bike, there are fewer. It's harder to make a poorly fitting triathlon bike work than it is to make a poorly fitting road bike work. So make sure it fits, first of all, and then whatever it is that you're buying, I would say I would totally support a decision of getting a lower end frame with a higher end front end, maybe like an aftermarket front end, in order to make it adjustable and aerodynamic. Because going back to what I said earlier about rider position being super important to the end aerodynamic result, nothing affects that aerodynamic position more than your interaction with the front end of the bike. So having that front end be extremely adjustable and easy to adjust is a huge win for anyone who is interested in becoming as aerodynamic as they can possibly be.
Mm. Do you have any examples of bikes that come with what you would consider a good front and adjustable front end, and also aftermarket front ends if people want to upgrade and maybe go for a cheaper frame and buy the front end separately?
Yeah, I will say that I have no affiliation with any of these folks that I'm talking about right now, but let me give you an example of a really bad front end first. And this is just because this bike is amazing in a million different ways, but it's old and this wasn't thought of too much, I guess, back in the day. But the original Cervelo P5, it's still one of the fastest bikes out there in the tunnel, and it's a phenomenal bike by all accounts. But adjusting the front end of that bike is impossible. It is such a nightmare because of the way the cables are routed, and it was a hydraulic rim brake bike, one of the only ones I think in triathlon, and everything is routed through the headset. So basically, if you want to make any stack changes on that bike, so that's height changes, you basically have to pull the thing apart and have a mechanic reassemble it for you. So that would be the spectrum of the least adjustable, hardest to work on bikes. If I'm doing an aero test on someone with a P5, I really have to manage my expectations or manage their expectations. Say like, here's what we can touch in the field, and here's what we won't be able to do. On the flip side, you can take the new P5, and it has a very, very good adjustability from the front end perspective. So this is both the P, used to be the P5X, now the PX from Cervelo. Or their P5 time trial frame. They have a monopost design for adjusting stack. Again, stack being the height. It's quite easy to do. I've worked on the P5X before. It is very user friendly, very easy to adjust. Similar bikes. The new Ventum, I believe, has a similar setup. We've adjusted it when we were working with Cody Beals. It's not quite as slick as the Cervelo, but it still does the job quite well. Aftermarket wise, the Tri-Rig Alpha 1 bar is very easy to work with. I've worked with that bar as well. They've done a lot of good engineering on the adjustability side of that bar. So there's lots of options, and way more in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, when manufacturers, both OE bike makers as well as folks like Tri-Rig, folks who are just making components, they're paying a lot more attention to this element, because it is critically important, and they're starting to understand it. And they're more and more manufacturers, even some of the traditional folks like Profile, who are paying attention and creating really good smart products. So most stuff on the market these days is going to be actually quite good. It's a good time to, well, it's maybe not a good time to buy a bike because you can't get components, but from an engineering perspective, there's some really, really well thought out front ends out there.
It's also very expensive. I've been looking at the prices recently compared to, I don't know, 3 years ago when I bought my bike. And the inflation is high in the cycling world. Let's put it that way. So that's great information. Are there any other considerations to keep in mind? For example, what's your take on integration of hydration and nutrition and so on? Is that something that you would consider important?
Yeah, actually, that's an excellent point, and this is something that when I talk about this to other folks too, this is a point that I try to drive across. Even though sort of quote unquote naked bikes have converged in terms of the aerodynamics. By naked, I mean without stuff strapped onto them. It does make sense to have some integration where where your ability to carry your tools, your hydration, your nutrition are not an afterthought to the bike, where they were for, all the years before, I would say maybe 10 years ago, where you had to, you saw people taping gels to their top tubes and had jersey pockets stuffed with things that are poking out and not being very aero friendly. These days, you can definitely get a bike where you can do an Ironman without having anything in a jersey pocket, without having any bottles in the wind, without having any tools, again, duct tape to the back of your seat, where everything is thought out and hidden from the wind. I know some manufacturers, some people do this better than others. So it's a good idea to put your hands on this integration, to actually go and try to access one of the storage boxes, let's say in the frame above the bottom bracket, for example, where a lot of folks are putting toolkits, right? So can you easily access this toolkit? Is it big enough to store all the things you need? If you're riding tubeless, you maybe need a tube, maybe you don't need a tube. Or if you're riding tubular still, which I guess a few people still are, can you stuff a whole tubular tire in this setup? So it's important to make sure that the way that you want to ride and the things you want to carry work with the level of integration that your bike offers. Same goes for bottles. Like, how many bottles are you planning on carrying? And I know that's a follow-up question for you down the line, Michael. But how many bottles do you want to carry on this bike versus how many do you want to access from the aid stations? So how many bottles will this bike comfortably hold for you, and is that enough for your fuel and nutrition setup? So for sure, an important consideration. And this is where it might make sense to spend a little bit more on a frame, because generally the more expensive frames do have a little bit more of this integration, but the integration also has to work for you as the athlete.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that the bottle question is an interesting one, because we know from a lot of testing that when you put a bottle on the bike, on the frame, we install a bottle cage on the frame and we put a bottle in there, especially if it's a non-aero bottle, but even aero bottles, we do get a penalty there, which is an aero penalty, which is not necessarily the case depending on where we put it. If we put it between the arms, it might be a wash or even potentially an advantage in some cases, and behind the saddle as well, depending on the angle of it, we might not have the same issue. So yeah, just thinking about these things and how much hydration you need to carry, and how much you and nutrition, of course, and tools, and how you will be able to manage that without necessarily causing additional aero penalties, which in the past you were basically forced to, no matter how you tried. That's an important consideration, I think, as well.
I agree, especially the bottle. So, I mean, putting a bottle between the aerobars is a no-brainer. It's usually fairly straightforward, especially with traditional round aerobar extensions. A lot of modern front-end designers are building in, bosses for cages directly onto, say, the bridge between the extensions or something like that. The frames on the bottle, bottles on the frame, manufacturers are thinking about, and not usually, but often with modern bikes, they will sell you their own aero bottle that integrates very neatly into the frame. Now, aero bottles you pay a penalty for sure. Like if you take like the Elite Chrono bottle, it's only, I think, 200 or 250 milliliters of capacity versus a 600 or 750 milliliter round bottle. So you're losing a lot of capacity there. Sure, it's more aerodynamic, but you have to think about, like, what am I going to put in there? Is this going to be a nutrition storage, or is it actually going to be fluids? It's not really that much room for fluids. So things of that, again, going back to what I said earlier about the setup has to make sense for you and what your race nutrition plan is. But you bring up the good point of behind the saddle. If a bike manufacturer has thought about how this bottle is going to sit and going to be attached, that is a win, because there are times, because historically these bottles were attached to saddle rails. And sometimes it's not possible to set up the exact setup you want and attach it to saddle rails, because saddle rails on different saddles have slightly different angles. And also, if you're running a saddle very far forward, part of the seat post may occlude your preferred mounting of the rear cage, behind the bottle cage. So if a bike manufacturer has thought about this and has installed an easy means for you to mount a bottle behind your saddle, that I would say is a win. That would be a tick in favor of that particular make and model.
Yeah, good point. So another question about road versus tri bike is there a point when you're racing, let's say, a very hilly or even mountainous course? I'm thinking about something like Ironman Lanzarote, which has 2,400 meters of gain, or Ironman 17.3 Andorra, which has 2,000 meters of gain in a half Ironman. Is there a point at which you should race your road bike rather than your TT bike, because there's so much climbing that the aero penalty is not going to outweigh the climbing benefits potentially of the road bike, and descending as well?
Mm-hmm. So this is a really complicated question, because it's going to come with a lot of it depenses. So if you are, so one thing I'll kind of give my stock answer to this. If you look at Lanzarote and you look at the folks who are doing well there, they're all on triathlon bikes, right? They're all riding, TT tri bikes. So they've done their math. Their coaches have done their math, and they've gone triathlon bike. And that's not necessarily, I wouldn't immediately fall back to that and say that's, case closed, but that is a strong indicator for me that that's the way to go. And here's the other point I'll make. So obviously Lanzarote has much more elevation than the average course, but it is, you're still, what goes up still comes down. So you are still gaining the, whatever you lose on the way up, you're still partially gaining it on the way down in terms of aerodynamic drag. And I actually ran the numbers. I did a little quick simulation for Lanzarote specifically for someone my height and my weight, rather, more so than my height doesn't really matter. My weight, if I went from a triathlon bike to a road bike, and if we're purely looking at weight savings, I might save, just on my setup, road versus tri, I might save 2 kilos. Okay, so like a heavy tri bike versus a very fairly light road bike, I might be looking at a 2 kilo difference. For me, 2 kilos would add 1 minute 40 seconds to my time at Lanzarote. Okay, so a little bit less than 2 minute penalty to go with the heavier tri bike. But if you think back to what I was saying earlier about how much time I could save on a tri bike, that was 17 minutes. Okay. Now, obviously, there are some nuances here, because I'm not going to be in the aero position the whole time. The 17-minute number was you're in aero the whole time on the tri bike, and you are in a good but on your hood's position on that road bike. So obviously, I'm going to be probably climbing on my hoods, and I'm going to be descending on my hoods, and I'm going to be living on my hoods if I was on a road bike for the most part. But on the tri bike, if I was climbing, there is a time that I'm going to sit up to climb. And I noticed that's a follow-up question as well. So this is not a fair comparison. It wouldn't be a 17-minute delta for aerodynamic sakes on that course, but I would be willing to bet, and as I said, as is evidenced by all the the smart, fast people that are on that course, that the aerodynamic wins, at least on Lanzarote for a tri bike, far outweigh the weight penalty.
Yeah, let's say even in an extreme case where you would spend just 1/3 of the time in the bars, you would still potentially look at gaining 6 minutes of in the aerodynamic benefits instead of the 17 minutes or something like that, and that would outweigh the 1 minute 40 that you said that you would gain weight-wise from going to the road bike. So that makes sense, and I'm glad you say that, because I've done that kind of calculus recently for a different race for Sentinel 3 Marbella, and came to the same conclusion that it makes sense.
Yeah. It does. I mean, the other consideration is handling, right? So weight is not the only consideration. So the road bikes are designed to descend quickly, and for folks who folks who are maybe less comfortable at descending. But I would argue that those folks might be less comfortable descending on regardless of the bike that they ride. And maybe this goes back to your question about considerations for a tri bike. If you are doing a very technical course with technical descents, then I would say disc brakes are a big advantage, because they do kind of inspire confidence if you know what you're doing on a technical descent course. But then again, almost all, with maybe a couple of exceptions, modern triathlon bikes are disc brake enabled. So that's again, unless you're buying used, that's kind of a moot point as well. So for descending, yes, a tri bike is not going to descend quite as well as a road bike, but if for someone who is a confident descender, that's probably also not going to make a massive difference either.
Yeah, and that's another reason, or a reason that I think that something like Lanzarote or Marbella, courses like that, they are made for tri bikes, because the descents there are not very technical. I haven't raced them, but that's my understanding. Whereas something like Andorra, I think, is a different ballgame, and that's where I think, from what I know about the course, again, not having ridden it myself, but I think I would go for a road bike on that course, not just because of the amount of climbing, which is quite extreme with 2,000 meters in a half distance race, but because of the descending, which is much more technical than those aforementioned courses.
Mm-hmm. And that's maybe a course where you do want to do a road bike with extensions, so then you kind of get, you can spend a little bit of time on those aero extensions when the course permits it, and you do get that aero advantage, and but you're not there for a long time, so you're offsetting the disadvantage of road bike with extensions being lack of comfort, with the fact that you're not on there for very long, because you're going to be climbing and descending not in those extensions, and maybe that's the optimal setup for a race like that. Yeah,
that makes sense. So if you're on a course, well, it doesn't even have to be an extremely hilly course, but a lot of courses have some amount of climbing in them, and depending on the duration and the power, the target power you have, there will come points in most courses where your speed slows down when you're climbing. At below what speed do you think it makes sense to sit up, get out of the aerobars, when you're on the TT bike and you start to climb and the speed starts to come down?
Yeah, well, here's let's cue the return of the "it depends" statement, call the qualified statement. Real briefly, obviously, when you're when you're on the skis and on the extensions, you're more aerodynamic. When you're sitting up, you're less aerodynamic. So, what's the point of sitting up, right? So, I can think of two really important ones for sitting up. First of all, just about everybody is going to produce a little bit more power when they're sitting up. And I'll definitely get into that a little bit more. And then the other one, I think, especially in long races, it's a good idea to change your position from time to time just to give your body a little bit of a break. And I'm not advocating this for long periods of time, but almost as a proactive stretch. So sitting up sometimes just, places different strains on your muscles because your joint angles change. Well, your hip angle is the primary one that changes, and the strain on the muscles changes. So I think those are the two pros of sitting up occasionally, especially when you need to climb. How much power do you gain when you're sitting up? Now, this really depends on what sort of training you're doing. Like if you're Dan Bigham, who, when he was last on our show, talked about when he's training for, his track season or his time trialing season, he basically does almost all of his riding, even his commutes in the TT position, because he wants to get as comfortable in that position as humanly possible. And the idea there is to make that gap between sitting up and being an aero as small as possible in terms of what can you comfortably hold in terms of wattage. Now, from my experience of myself and with folks I coach, you can probably comfortably get that down to about 5%, right? So let's say if we're talking about, power that you can hold at FTP, or, however you want to define FTP, that's a whole other thing. It's roughly a 5% difference for folks who are fairly well adapted. For some people, it might even be less. So if you're gaining 5% on that wattage, or put another way, for the same heart rate, you can produce 5% more wattage, which is roughly the case. Sitting up gives you a little bit of a boost in terms of power, but it doesn't give you a massive boost in terms of power. So all of this to say that my advice is you kind of want to stay in aero until you're going quite slowly, unless you need to do a stretch. So if we're talking about straight up, just the benefits of the extra power gained, I would say you'd want to be going well below 20 kilometers an hour. So maybe around, 17, 18 kilometers an hour, as if you want me to, put a number on it, before the wins that you get from sitting up outweigh the aerodynamic penalty of doing that.
Yeah, that's quite low. Yeah.
Yeah, but again, there's the more subjective value of changing your position, changing what you're doing, because especially in an Ironman race, you're in that position for so long that any excuse to change it, I think, is useful, especially if you're not going to be sitting up for very long.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true, and I think many of us have been out on a long ride when we start thinking, where is that damn hill that I'm coming towards, because we just want to get out of position and stretch a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Are there any other considerations for hilly courses? For example, and now we're perhaps going back to the questions regarding courses like Lanzarote, Andorra, and so on. Racing with a disc wheel, when is the extra weight not worth it compared to the aerodynamic gains? Also, things like carrying less hydration on the bike and relying more on aid stations. Are there any things that you would consider?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So on the subject of disc wheels, I'm a very pro disc wheel. In the right conditions, the benefit of a disc wheel is just tremendous. It can actually, in the right condition, and by the right conditions, I mean the right wind conditions, you can get into situations without even very strong winds that are coming in from the side, where a disc wheel will actually create negative drag or a propulsive force. So depending on the disc, somewhere around, I think even as low as I should have looked at my charts, but some as low as 10 or 15 degrees of yaw. So that's, the perceived angle of the wind hitting the rider. You might be getting into situations where you're actually getting thrust from that wheel. So listeners, that's actually, the wheel is actually helping you move forward. It's actually behaving like a sail on a sailboat and providing thrust to you. So I'm a big fan of disc wheels, and I cannot think, unless it's a net uphill course, which are very few and far between. I can't think of one actually in triathlon. I would run a disc wheel every single time that I'm allowed to do so, with the obvious caveat that you have to be comfortable riding that disc wheel. Now, I know folks who rent disc wheels for races, and I would be careful doing that if you've never ridden a disc wheel or you haven't ridden a disc wheel in the conditions of the race, because while it doesn't add to the steering torque, right? So because obviously it's in the back and not in the front, so it's not affecting how your bars behave. That extra surface area on the side of you plus bicycle creates that sailing effect, which means that any side wind will try to move you in the direction that is blowing, and it can be a very disconcerting feeling until you're used to it. But once you're used to it, I think it's brilliant, and it's fairly easy to handle. Once you're used to it. But I would say you'd want to run a disc on absolutely every race where the winds are predictable and you're comfortable handling the disc. And of course, it's allowed. Like in Kona, famously, discs are not allowed.
Yeah, no, I think I agree, and I think that it's a question that I get every now and then. Like the winds for this race are looking like they will be quite strong. Should I skip my disc wheel? And I would always go for no, keep the disc wheel. Like you're just going to benefit more. Of course, that kind of assumes that you have trained on it. But when you're used to it, I don't think the disc wheel handles any more. That it's any more difficult to handle the bike with a disc wheel than with just a deep section training wheel when you have done a bit of training on it. So yeah, I would agree with that completely. And regarding net uphill courses, I think potentially Alpe d'Huez long distance triathlon might be net uphill, but I'm not entirely sure about that. So good point about that. And what about the hydration question?
Yeah. So hydration, I would say, it depends on rider skill and how comfortable you are grabbing things from aid stations. I am a fan of running sort of, I wouldn't say minimal hydration, but I would say you want to have capacity for one oopsie, So if you miss one aid station for whatever reason, you're not paying attention or you drop a bottle, that you're not doomed, because obviously, and I think you've covered this in great detail, Michael, that hydration, nutrition on long courses is critically important. You don't want to ruin your day by trying to optimize aerodynamics a little bit or trying to optimize your weight a little bit. So my rule is I want to have one bottle, one sort of spare bottle that if I do miss an aid station, I'm not cooked. But generally I'll try to run minimal, having said that, I'll run minimal hydration, regardless of actually whether or not it's a big uphill course or not, because even a flat course, if you're running, for example, the obvious example is if you're running a bottle on your down tube, right, the front slope tube of your bicycle, that is a very bad place to put a round bottle. That's probably the worst. And so if your hydration strategy demands that you run a bottle there, maybe try to figure out a way that you can avoid running a bottle on the down tube, because that will definitely save you a watts, whether or not you're climbing or just going on a flat course, just because of the aero penalty. Again, that comes down to practice, right? Like practice those handoffs at the aid station so that you can reliably grab a bottle and minimize your risks of dropping it. And then again, that gives you the opportunity to stretch, right? So that if your aid stations are roughly every 20, 30 kilometers on most courses, that's generally a good time to sit up for 30 seconds, slow down a little bit, grab that bottle and keep going.
Yeah. No, I think that those are excellent points. And also, even if you don't have to run a bottle on the down tube, consider, for example, how long it might take you to grab a bottle from behind the saddle, drink, and put it back. How is that really that much more efficient than slowing down a little bit and grabbing a bottle from an aid station? Not necessarily. So yeah, those are just things to consider with that as well.
Totally agree.
Right. So let's start to wrap up this topic. Can you give a final summary and any tips that we might have left out or that you want to repeat regarding road versus triathlon bikes?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, so if you're stuck in an N+1 loop and you like buying more bikes, and your focus is triathlon, triathlon bike is always a really good idea, right? There's just so many advantages to to having the right fitting, easily adjustable triathlon bike versus a road bike when you're doing a non-drafting race, that it's very hard to find. You'd have to really work hard to find reasons not to do it. So yeah, I'm a huge fan. The point of road bike with extensions can be done, works quite well, I think, sometimes in short races, not so well in very long races. Aerodynamics trumps weight in a major way, so I wouldn't worry too much about the weight of your whole package, and pay more attention to the aerodynamics of the setup. And even in very uphill races, I still think that holds. And then finally, just practice what you're doing. And this is not new. This isn't obviously specific to getting as aerodynamic a setup as possible, but practice. Practice grabbing those bottles, practice your setup, practice holding that position. If you actually have the opportunity to get some aerodynamic testing done, and you've found your optimal position, it behooves you to learn to keep that position for the duration of the race. So it's something that you can get super slippery, but if it's incredibly uncomfortable and then you're not going to be able to hold it, then that doesn't really make, it's not gonna get you to the finish line any faster. So practice is a really big one too.
Yeah, excellent points. And we have been going for a while, so let's do the rapid fire questions here, and I'll break this part out in a separate episode from our next topic. So the first rapid fire question is, what's your favorite book or resource related to triathlon or endurance sports?
So this changes because there's so many excellent resources. So for this edition, Michael, I will cite Collie Moore, both on his Instagram channel, where he does AMAs about training every weekend, as well as his really, really good empirical cycling podcast. And I believe he was a guest on your show in the past as well.
Yep. And what's an important habit that you've benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
I think understanding and really almost daily thinking about what I have control over and what I have less control or no control over, and really putting my decisions and putting my energy into the things that I can control, and really practicing hard, not dwelling on things I cannot control. It's a work in progress. I'm still not there yet for sure, but it's something that has given me a lot of over time, quite a bit of mental and kind of emotional calm and well-being following that strategy.
That's really helpful, and not something that has been mentioned before. So good one. And finally, who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
So this is I'll shout out another guest who's been on both of our shows, Bjorn Kafka of Aerotune, and I think he's one of the. And what I really like about Bjorn is that he coaches some very high level athletes. He's developing some pretty sort of cutting edge stuff for Aerotune on their metabolic models. But at the same time, he is incredibly generous with his knowledge and his time. He's not one of these people that says, no, this is my proprietary special sauce and I will not tell anyone about it. He is super willing to share what he knows, and in my experience with him has gone above and beyond and given me essentially like free world, top level advice for my own training. And that's who I try to emulate in my own coaching practice.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. Bjorn is an absolutely fantastic guy. And finally, tell the listeners where they can find you and your podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for the offer to plug, Michael. So Endurance Innovation, as I said earlier in the show, is our podcast. We are almost at the end of year 3 of our podcasting journey, Andrew and myself, and it's available anywhere you get your podcasts. Just look for Endurance Innovation, and we're also on Instagram under Endurance Innovation. But mostly what I put up there is just notifications of new episodes.
Yeah, and listeners, I'm a listener of Endurance Innovation, and they have some great guests and great topics, so definitely worth checking it out. And keep up the good work, Michael and Andrew as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on, Michael.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com, where we have links to Michael's website, as well as the Endurance Innovation podcast and Instagram. I'll also link to a road bike versus tri-bike episode that Michael and Andrew did on the Endurance Innovation podcast quite a few years ago, and a couple of Q&A episodes that I have done myself on the topic. But I will say that I do think that we covered this topic in full. We didn't miss out or leave out anything. So I'm including most of these episodes mostly for completion, really. There may be some details that we didn't discuss that you might find in these episodes, but I'm not saying that you have to go and listen to them or anything, because I do think that we discussed most of the aspects of road bike versus tri bikes in this particular episode. Michael will be back next week, and we will discuss aerodynamic testing, including both sensor-based and sensor-less systems, so stay tuned for that. And if you want to improve your triathlon performance and want help to achieve your goals, then consider working with a scientific triathlon coach or training plan. We have helped athletes of all different levels, from beginners just getting into triathlon to athletes that want to race professionally or are racing professionally. And we would love to discuss with you if we can help you on your triathlon journey. You can find out more and contact us on scientifictriathlon.com. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use their free online sweat test and quick carb calculator to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs, and book a free video consultation with the team to refine your strategy. Use the code TTS22 at checkout for 15% off your first order of fueling and hydration products. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and exceptional sunglasses and prescription glasses for everything from day-to-day wear to extreme action sports. Use the promo code that you get on roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire Roka order. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.